welcome to another broadcast of Comics Let's Talk. The late, great Len Wien was one of my favorite comic book authors of all time, and we're going to talk about his legacy on this broadcast today. My name is Kevin Given, and I write comic book reviews and have a column on the comic book site called Comics for Sinners. My column is given to me, and usually I discuss my own creation of Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter. If you're interested, you can check it out online. Comics for Sinners, once again. And the column is given to me. Len Wien was born June 12, 1948 in New York City. He graduated high school in 1966. He had an art degree from Farmingdale College. He was a very sickly kid. His father bought him a ton of comic books, and he was hooked from that moment on. At first, he wanted to be an artist, not a writer. DC Comics had a weekly tour of their offices in New York City, and his friend Marv Wolfman would take those tours at least once a month. Eventually, they got to talking to the editors, and DC editor Joe Orlando hired Wien and his friend Marv Wolfman to write some stories. His first published story was in Teen Titans number 18, December 1968. He created the character of Red Star, which was the first Russian superhero from DC Comics. He created that character with Marv Wolfman. And Len Wien would go on to write anthology series for DC's House of Secrets, Marvel's Tower of Shadows, and Chamber of Darkness. He also wrote for DC's romance title called Secret Hearts, and for the comic book toy tie-in Hot Wheels. And he would write for Skywald, Nightmare, and Psycho magazines. At Gold Key, he would write for Boris Karloff's Tales of Mystery.
An instrument of murder is hardly a proper toy for an 8-year-old, as sure as my name is Boris Karloff. And this instrument casts an evil shadow even beyond the death it has caused. And upon it is the mark of the hand. That's the name of our story, based on a novel by the celebrated Charlotte Armstrong.
Also the TV tie-ins for Star Trek and Twilight Zone, and the Hot Wheels kind of knockoff called Mod Wheels. Now, when I was a kid, I read the Star Trek comics quite religiously. I loved the TV show, and Gold Key picked up the series in 1967 while the TV series was still on the air. Len Wien is credited with writing issues 9 through 14. I didn't know who Len Wien was at the time because Gold Key never published their credits on their title pages. They would leave it blank. They never published what an issue number on the cover was, nor did they publish credits of who wrote and drew the issues. But I noticed that some of the issues were better written than others. So as I got older, I researched who wrote and drew what. Len Wien is credited with writing the issues 9 through 14. My favorite Star Trek comic is uncredited, but probably was written by Len Wien. It was number 31. It's Kirk versus Kirk. The Kirk from the previous galaxy was put in some kind of canister, and our current Kirk picked up that canister, the Enterprise picked up the canister, and out popped other James T. Kirk. And they fought. They had a fencing match. It was a great comic book. Kind of silly. Gold Key's Star Treks were silly, but some were really well written, some were really far-fetched. But that was my favorite, and I'm pretty sure that was a Len Wien comic book, but it does not list the credits as such. So I don't know if it was or wasn't. But anyway, his first Marvel comic book was Daredevil number 71 from December 1970. He also worked on DC's Adventure Comics, which featured Supergirl and Zatanna. He also worked on The Flash, Superman, and Phantom Stranger. Then perhaps one of his greatest creations, Swamp Thing. He created that character with Bernie Wrightson, tragically another icon, comic book artist that passed away this year. The first appearance of Swamp Thing was House of Secrets number 92 in 1971. And that went on to develop its own series, which lasted until 1976. 2 movies and a syndicated television series were based upon the Swamp Thing comic book. Also a 5-episode animated series came out. They also did the saga of the Swamp Thing with Alan Moore in the 1980s. And he also wrote for Marvel's Man-Thing, which was Marvel's version of a similar character, a swamp monster that was kind of created. It's hard to tell who created what first because they came out like within a couple months of each other. And that comic book introduced Barbara or Bobby Morse. Also the concept, whoever knows fear burns at the Man-Thing's touch. He later edited Steve Gerber's run on that title. There was a Man-Thing movie made also, but it bore very little resemblance to the Marvel comic books character. He had a brief run on the Justice League, issues number 100 to 114 with Dick Dillon, and he reintroduced the Seven Soldiers of Victory in that title, also the Freedom Fighters. Another creation was The Human Target, which also saw 2 television series, a short-lived show on ABC with Rick Springfield, plus the Mark Valley series in 2010 on Fox, which lasted a couple of seasons. For Detective Comics, he wrote a Batman story where Batman was blamed for the murder of Talia al Ghul. For Marvel, he worked on Marvel Team-Up, Amazing Spider-Man, Incredible Hulk, The Fantastic Four, The Defenders, and Brother Voodoo. The Hulk story between Hammer and Anvil is on the list of 1,000 comics you must read before you die. Now, a lot of people think that Chris Claremont was the creator of the new X-Men with Dave Cockrum, but that's not the case. Here's Chris now to set the record straight.
How did you get the idea to give a new start to the X-Men?
Actually, I didn't. Len Wien and Dave Cockrum did, working with Roy Thomas and Stan Lee. They did the first issue, which is Giant Size X-Men #1, and then Len had to leave the book, and he said, wanted to know who was going to wanted to write it. I didn't even give him a chance to ask a question. I just kicked down his door, jumped on him, and said, "I'm doing it," because I'd helped him with a couple of little moments along the way in Giant Size, and I wanted to work with Dave Cockrum really badly.
That's right. Len Wien and Dave Cockrum created the modern X-Men. Now, Chris Claremont, of course, went on to really develop the characters and flesh them out, but Wien was the original writer on that. Len would have a fallout with Marvel Comics and then return to DC in the 1980s, late 70s and early 80s. In Batman number 307, Len Wien created Lucius Fox, a character played by Morgan Freeman in the Dark Knight trilogy. He also created Clayface in Detective Comics number 478. He worked on the Untold Legends of Batman, plus the Batman and Incredible Hulk crossover comic book, which was a giant-sized Treasury edition. He worked on Camelot 3000, the New Teen Titans, All-Star Squadron, and Batman and the Outsiders. He was editor of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, which was based on Carlton Comics. It's a shame that they didn't use the Carlton comic book characters. Moore had to recreate characters that were inspired by Carlton Comics because they wouldn't let him use the Carlton Comics characters in this story, as they had plans for those characters in the DC universe. But I say it's a different universe anyway. You've got Richard Nixon still as president in the 1980s, and I think they should have let him use the Carlton Comics characters. That would have been a great homage to Carlton Comics superheroes. He also worked on Legends, the Blue Beetle revival, the DC Challenge, and Wonder Woman with George Perez. And he would create Gunfire with Steve Irwin. After he left DC again, he moved to the West Coast and became editor-in-chief at Disney for 3 years in the early 90s. And after leaving Disney, he wrote and edited animation shows like X-Men, Batman, Spider-Man, Street Fighter, and many, many. And for Dark Horse, he worked on the Conan Book of Thoth with Kurt Busiek and Kelly Jones. He worked for Penny Farthing Publications on Victorian, also Bongo Comics, Simpsons, and Futurama. He also worked on the Watchmen video game, The End Is Nigh. He returned to DC and worked on their retroactive titles, Batman the 70s and Green Lantern the 80s. He also wrote, or co-wrote, Batman 66, the Two-Face story, which is being turned into an animated movie. Adam West's last performance as Batman will be Batman 66, Batman meets Two-Face. Wien's health started to slow down, and he had to undergo triple bypass surgery in 2015. Sadly, he passed away recently on September 10th, 2017. Len Wien's awards included 3 Shazam Awards for his work on Swamp Thing, including Dark Genesis, which was Swamp Thing #1 in 1972. He won the Comic Fan Art Award in 1974 for Best Writer. He also won the Ink Spot Award in 1977, also the Comic Buyers Award in 1982 for Best Editor. And he was inducted in the Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame in 2008. It's a brief look at what Len Wien contributed to the world of comic books, both Marvel and DC. He created Swamp Thing. He created Wolverine.
When I first created Wolverine, I created him as a Canadian mutant, specifically so that whomever ended up with the assignment of writing the new X-Men book, should it ever occur, would have a Canadian mutant handy if he wanted him. I think from our perspective, what makes Wolverine so attractive is the unpredictability. The belief that he doesn't give a damn about anybody but himself, and spends his whole life proving that's not true. In the first film, there's that great moment where he first meets Rogue, and he's going to dump her by the side of the road because she's not what he wants at that moment. He's in search of something else, and she goes, "Well, if you leave me here, where do I go? What do I do?" And he says, "I don't know." She says, "You don't know or don't care?" He says, "Pick one." And I think that kind of describes the character. And yet he spends the rest of the film protecting her and spending the whole thing trying to save her life, even though he's just said to her, "I don't care what happens to you." It's not true. At the heart of him, he cares what happens to everybody around him.
He created the new X-Men, which is one of the most important titles in Marvel's history. And that's all the time we have for this program. Come on and join me next week. We'll have another broadcast of comics. Let's talk. Remember to check out the website Comics for Sinners and my comic book reviews, as well as my column Given to Me, which looks at the production of Carl Vincent Vampire Hunter, the movie Last Rites, The Return of Sebastian Basilis. You can find all things Carl Vincent on Amazon, Indie Planet, Drive-Thru Comics, and Kindle. Until next week, this is Kevin Given saying so long and keep reading those comics.